There are two very special kinds of plants, especially food plants, that people are trying to bring back to New York City and other regions too. One is an indigenous plant, and that means something that came into existence right here where we live. It's something that has been here growing and developing right in its own soil. And the other kind that people are very interested in is called an heirloom plant or an heirloom food. And that doesn't necessarily come from nature in this area, but people brought it here a long time ago, or in their farms it developed through their care, or maybe also sometimes by accident. When those things develop and they happen to be delicious and they're different and nutritious and all that, that's another reason to be kept, even though it didn't grow here in nature and it grew here in our traditional farms instead. Because unfortunately today in the world we sometimes have a bad side to the efficiency of growing food all around the world that can be shipped everywhere. Is that one, you're using a lot of fuel to bring a fresh flower or a fresh fruit from Africa or Asia or South America to go to your market. You know, sometimes you pick a fruit and you think, I just got it from my corner store, but you don't realize the story behind it. It goes thousands of miles, and that's a lot of fuel that's used. The other thing is, the more differences you have between plants, and this goes for people and animals as well, the better chance that that will survive a disease. Because if you have everyone the same, and there's a disease that comes, and that disease can affect that plant or that kind of person, then it can wipe through everyone or everything. So having all kinds of different people and all kinds of different plants, even like different apples, even though we have a category, one kind of apple and there's only one kind of human, even if you have variety within those things, that's a great defense because that means that you have all kinds of different solutions from nature how to survive. So we have indigenous and heirloom are the two things, and that's why this is an heirloom variety. The one we're talking about, not this one here, but the apple that we're bringing back is an heirloom variety. It was grown in what today is Elmhurst, Queens. I don't know if anyone here has been to Elmhurst, Queens. Okay, it was grown in Elmhurst, Queens around 1730, so almost 300 years ago. It was a farmer who just happened to have a kind of an odd change to one of his trees, and he tasted it. He said, "Wow, this is good." And that was very good for him because that he was able to sell that around the country and eventually around the world because people had never tasted anything like that. And so unfortunately we lost that tradition in New York though, even though it was grown in Virginia and other places. And so we're bringing it back to New York City. A lot of you know his family, the farmer, his name was Gershon Moore. His great-great-great-grandson, I think, was Clement Clark Moore, who wrote the story "'Twas the Night Before Christmas." So, same family in our city history in two different ways. We have a strange history behind the Newtown Pippin, actually. Like I mentioned, it was from Elmhurst, Queens. Well, here's the funny thing. It was grown back when Elmhurst was called Newtown. And it became famous around the world. Thomas Jefferson, have you guys learned about Thomas Jefferson? When he was in France, just after we were becoming an independent nation, before our Constitution was even fully written and all that stuff, he was in France talking to the French about, you know, securing our future. And while he was over there, he didn't even like the apples there. He wrote a letter back saying, "They have no apples here to compare with our Newtown Pippin." So he was already a food snob in France. And so he grew them on his farm, and George Washington loved them. It was his favorite apple. He grew them on his farm and all in Virginia. They became like so popular in Virginia because, you know, if Washington and Jefferson are growing them, then everyone who has like a little estate or, you know, a fancy house is like, "Oh, I've got to have one," you know. So they all grew them. And what happened was it became more fashionable there than here. And then during the 19th century, remember we had the Civil War. You know, that's when Abraham Lincoln was there to help bring us together again, and it was a terrible time. And so the Southerners did not like the Northerners, and they're like, "This is our favorite apple and has a Northern name." So they wanted to rename it. So they renamed it the Albemarle Pippin, which is the county where Jefferson had his home. So the apple lost its Newtown. Now back here in New York City, where Newtown was in Queens, the creek that led up to Newtown was getting dirtier and dirtier. We had all kinds of industry there. There was oil industry and paint factories and tanneries that make leather. You know, they use like very harsh chemicals, especially back then. And so the water was so polluted that one year it actually even caught on fire, which when your creek catches on fire, that's a very bad sign. So the creek got so polluted that the people in Newtown, they said, I don't want to have the same name as this creek because no one's going to want to live here. So they couldn't rename the creek because the creek is something that everybody shares and it has to go up to the federal government and all that stuff. It was a big process to rename a big waterway. So that, well, we can rename our town. So they renamed their town Elmhurst to try to like get away from that Newtown name that was on the Newtown Creek. They were like, we don't want to be associated with that thing. So the Apple lost its Newtown, and then Newtown lost its Newtown. So, you know, sometimes you connect two dots, but in this case, the two dots were erased. So New York forgot its own history, and New York just chugged along and grew and became very industrial, you know, and put up skyscrapers and all these things. And everyone just forgot entirely that we ever had farms in New York City. It was just erased from our memory. Many people moved in from all parts of the world. Like my family came here, my grandparents, you know, long after New York ever grew apples in any real way. So we erased our own history. And you know, now of course, one of you might ask me at some point, so I'll ask you, what is New York City's nickname? Does anyone know the nickname for New York City?
The Big Apple.
Exactly. You know what though? It has nothing to do with the Newtown Pippin. It has nothing to do with any apple we've ever grown here. It was a horse racing term. It meant the big prize. You know, if you were a horse racer, you won in New York City. That was, you know, the most famous place. That's where all the rich people were when America was growing, and we had the biggest city, and all the wealth was concentrated. So they wanted to win here. And a lot of the people who worked with the horses were African American. And now, does everyone know their music history? What kind of music came out of the African American community? Does anyone like the biggest famous breakthrough music? Anyone? Jazz. So, jazz came out of that community. And so you had this connection between the horse racing, where you had a lot of African American workers, and jazz. So then the jazz musicians picked up that nickname of the Big Apple. Because if you were a jazz musician, New York had the big stage and the Broadway and Harlem, the Cotton Club and everything. It was the biggest place to make your career. So everyone called it the Big Apple. They were like, you know, if you were a guy from a small town or a woman who wanted to be a big singer and you lived in, you know, a smaller city in the Midwest, whatever, you came here to make your name. So they called it the Big Apple, the big prize. So that's where the name came from. It has nothing to do with this or any kind of apple you can grow.
The life of a farmer.
You guys are changing it by growing apples and growing the kind of apple that comes from New York City. And it's, you know, the Newtown Pippin can be America's kind of symbol for New York City. When they think of New York City, they can think of the Newtown Pippin if you guys are part of growing it all over the city.
Okay. Here we go. Riley, be careful. You're